What have we seen so far in Mark's Gospel? Well, Jesus has arrived on the scene, hasn't he? And the Gospel, the good news, has been proclaimed. There's a new king in town. A new regime has started. And we've seen that Jesus has great power. He's got power over people, power over evil spirits. He's even got power over sickness and disease. But we also saw how Jesus' biggest priority, his first priority, was to preach the good news. He was interested in preaching, spreading the words. And then last time we saw that this amazing king who's doing all these miracles, who's changing the community, well, he's rejected by the religious establishment, the Pharisees. And remember, we saw those challenges, 3 challenges to Jesus. They challenged him about fasting. Why aren't your disciples fasting like we do, like John the Baptist? And then they attacked him regarding the Sabbath day, verse 23 to 28. How comes you and your disciples are gathering grain on the Sabbath? They said that's breaking the rules. And it seems to come to a head at the beginning of chapter 3 in a synagogue where Jesus is the guest speaker. And the Pharisees set a trap. There's a disabled man strategically placed at the front of the church, or the synagogue, and they're watching to see if Jesus is going to heal him. Will he heal him on the Sabbath? And of course Jesus does. But rather than rejoice that this guy has been amazingly transformed, his life's been turned around by Jesus doing this great miracle, verse 6 of chapter 3, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him or kill him. This is unbelievable, isn't it? Here's a man who's doing nothing but good works. He's doing miracles in front of the Pharisees' eyes, transforming lives, transforming communities, and all they want to do is kill him. The Pharisees go to the Herodians. Jesus is the genuine king of Israel. But at the time, there is a puppet king on the throne, a king we're probably familiar with. Herod Antipas is his name. He was the son of the King Herod who tried to kill Jesus when he was born. Remember the Nativity story? The king comes after Christ. Well, this is his son. King Herod was a phony king. He'd been put there by the Romans. He wasn't even 100% Jewish. His father was an Edomite. But his supporters, the Herodians, so people who wanted Herod as king, they saw Jesus as a kind of Che Guevara type character. A rebel who would rise up and rattle the Romans. And of course, if the Romans saw that Herod couldn't control his territory, well, they'd remove him. So the Herodians saw Jesus as a threat. Who is this rebel? He's going to get us all killed. He was a threat to the political order. So they join the Pharisees and they plot to kill Jesus. The king is rejected by the political elite. That's what we saw last week. And that's important as we come to our passage this morning, because today we're going to see how Jesus is going to establish a brand new nation, the King's nation. Now, the birth of a nation is something to celebrate, isn't it? I was in America a long time ago now, and it's 4th of July, and the Americans go nuts. They love the 4th of July. Independence Day, there's fireworks, there's food, there's singing, there's community events. It's a national holiday. Well, our passage this morning shows us the birth of our Christian nation. This is the beginning of the church. And the church is a new nation. Did you realise that? It's a new Israel. We are the people of God. We are Israel. None of us would be in this building today if the events in this passage hadn't taken place. So for Christians, this is our Independence Day story. But before we look at how Jesus forms this new nation, we've got to do a bit of work. First of all, Mark gives us the context. How does this take place? Well, look at verse 7 of chapter 3:7. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed. The first part of Jesus' ministry had been centred around the synagogue, the Jewish place of worship, like a church. But now that the religious establishment has rejected him, well, Jesus rejects them. He withdraws. He says, all right, I'm not going to come to your places of worship. I'm going to go to the open air. I'm going to do some open air ministry. Traditional settings for preaching are no longer going to cut the mustard. So he heads down to the lake, to the Sea of Galilee. But the king's followed, isn't he? And he's not followed by the elite. He's followed by normal run-of-the-mill people. He's followed by people from Galilee. And these people who follow Jesus, they've got the unglamorous title of peasants. So look at the end of verse 8. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. This is a great crowd of normal, very poor people. Jesus' fame has spread, hasn't it? It doesn't need Facebook or you don't need to buy Twitter. No, the news spreads through the grapevine. Oh, did you hear about that new rabbi, that Joshua guy? And you've got to come and hear him, it's amazing. And so the news spreads on the grapevine. And no matter what you thought of this man Jesus, you couldn't argue with what he was doing. When you saw his miracles, something was going on. This was amazing. God was working. People had seen it, they'd experienced it. They knew people who had diseases who'd been healed. And so they told the good news to their friends. And his fame spreads all over Israel. But notice where people come from. So here's our map. They come from Galilee, verse 7. As you know, Galilee is in the north of Israel. This is Jesus' local area. This is where he was brought up. And this is where he does most of his ministry. But then we're told they came from Judea in the south, Jerusalem, the capital city. Idumea was even further south, there it is. And this was a former Edomite territory that had now been added to Israel. So this wasn't even part of Israel originally. And then he says regions beyond the Jordan, Perea. So on the east side of the River Jordan. And as far north as Tyre and Sidon. You can see Tyre if you squint, right at the top. Do you see then that where the Jewish establishment has rejected the king, normal run-of-the-mill Jews from up and down the territory flock to Jesus. And part of the Pharisees' punishment for rejecting their Messiah is that now they're going to be left on the outside of this new nation. These men who desire power and influence in society, they're going to have no power, no influence where it counts most. Again in verse 9, Jesus' priority is to preach. Verse 9, he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. I wonder, have you ever seen a news clip where an aid truck arrives and people are just scrabbling to get food? Throngs of people, and all they want is a morsel of rice. And they're pushing past one another. They're scratching, reaching because they're so hungry. Well, that's the way it was whenever Jesus turned up. Wherever he went, there were desperate people trying to be healed. And a touch of his garment is all it will take. If I can just grab him, if I can just touch the bottom of his cloak, I can be healed, I can have my life changed. So Jesus has to get into this little fishing boat so that he can preach, because that's what he wants to do. He can preach without being mocked. Verse 11, whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." We saw a few weeks ago, didn't we, that Jesus doesn't need demonic character witnesses. So verse 12, he ordered them not to make him known. Okay, that's the context. You've got the political elite rejecting Christ. You've got the man on the street thinking something's up, flocking to him. Now we get the calling of the disciples. Now, in less time than you or I could get a GCSE or get a university degree, in just under 2 years from this point, spoiler alert, they're going to kill Jesus on the cross. When Jesus dies, he's going to be resurrected, as we know, but then he's going to go back into heaven. Who's going to carry the king's nation forward when Jesus is no longer here on earth? Well, here's God's plan, right? 12 ordinary men. These men that he's picking, they're going to be ambassadors. They're going to take his teaching and his message out into the world. To the outside, these men, well, they look feeble. Again, they're 12 peasants. Most of them are fishermen. Probably only a handful of them could read. You wonder, why aren't there more Gospels from the Apostles? Well, it's because probably a lot of them didn't know how to read and write. And yet these men are the ones Jesus uses to establish his church. They are the foundations on which he's going to build the next age. And what's the outstanding characteristic? What strikes you about these men? Well, it's their normality. They're just normal, ordinary blokes. The king is going to delegate essential authority to these guys. That's it, and there's no plan B. So, a few observations about Jesus' calling. First up, the calling of the disciples is at Jesus' initiative. Verse 13, he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And there's no votes. No one says, all right, we want Peter and James and Jude to be disciples. There's no running for office. There's no wanting the job. It's not like Bartholomew says, I'll do it. No, Jesus says, you're doing it. He says, come with me. No interviews, no forms to fill out. Jesus chooses them simply because he desires them. He wants them for the job. And so he calls them out. In Luke chapter 6 verse 12, we find out that Jesus has spent the whole night before this praying. So he's praying to God about the choice that he's going to make. So think about it. The Son of God prays to the Father through the power of the Holy Spirit. So this is a Trinitarian communication, isn't it? God is talking to God. God is making a plan with himself. And therefore it reminds us of Genesis 1, doesn't it? On the sixth day, God said, let us make man in our image. The Father, Son, the Spirit, here are on the verge of another great creation event. They're saying, well, we're going to create a new mankind. We're going to create a new nation in our image. The last image went wrong, so we've got a new one to form. So let's use these 12 men. Second observation, a significant number of men. He chooses 12, not 10, not 15, not 20, not 200. Super simple question, wake you up. Why 12? 12 tribes of Israel. Well done, Michael. Yeah. Now, in the Old Testament, 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob became the 12 tribes of Israel. But 10 of these tribes had kind of been lost. There were still remnants of them. But as bodies, they were gone. They'd been taken into Assyria years and years ago, centuries earlier, and the northern tribes had just dissipated, they'd gone, carried off into slavery. But as you read through the Old Testament, the prophets told of a restoration. God was going to raise up a branch from the royal tribe of Judah, a descendant of David, and that king was going to restore the whole nation. The nation had been split, but this king was going to unify it. And that king would feed his people. So here's King Jesus, and he makes a deliberate, calculated decision and action. He's choosing 12. He's choosing 12 new tribe leaders, 12 elders. And no one on that mountain, as they saw him doing this, would have missed the significance of the choice. This man isn't just a healer, not just a good preacher with a few parlour tricks up his sleeve. No, this is the restoration we've been waiting for. This is our Messiah. This is the start of a new regime. And that explains verse 20 and 21, doesn't it? Now, my uncles are pretty normal, but I had a friend growing up whose uncle was a bit of an oddball. He was a bit weird. And you know how teenagers can be. We used to cuss him. We used to say, dude, mate, that's your uncle. I mean, that's your mum's brother. Aren't you embarrassed? I mean, he shares your DNA. What goes on at Christmas time? Are you sure you're not going to end up weird and strange and creepy like he is? Well, look at verse 21. When his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he's out of his mind. Jesus' mother and brothers and sisters are embarrassed by Jesus. They think he's lost his mind. They think he's gone crazy. There he is going around, and now he's gathered 12 new tribe elders that they can see the significance of what he's doing. They know that he's trying to start a revolution, and they think he's lost his mind. Who does he think he is? He's just a 30-year-old carpenter. So, number 12 is significant. Third observation, a significant venue. Where does this calling take place? Well, it takes place up a mountain, doesn't it? Verse 13, he went up a mountain. Funny enough, in our psalm this morning, I've been playing it, it talks about God bringing them to the mountain. Where's the original nation of Israel founded? Well, it's halfway up Mount Sinai. Exodus 19, verse 3, God calls Moses up and he says, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God calls his people to him on Sinai, and he says, you Israelites, you are to be an ambassador to the nations. You're to be my ambassadors. You're going to act as priests. Priests lead people into a loving relationship with God, don't they? And now Jesus appoints 12 men, his ambassadors, his vice-regents, who are going to lead the people of the world into a loving relationship with the Lord. So here, Jesus, just like back in Exodus, he's establishing a new kingdom, a new world order. And this kingdom is a kingdom we are now part of 2,000 years later. We are citizens of this new nation. But the question that Mark now wants to address is, what does it look like to be part of that kingdom? If we've been called to follow in Jesus' footsteps, if we've been called to be disciples of Jesus, what does that mean in our everyday life? What should our attitude be? What duties should I have to perform? So the third and final point then is Jesus' commission, what it means to be a disciple. What are our orders? What is our mission in life? Where are we going? We'll look at verse 14. He appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. So being a disciple means being with Jesus. You learn so much, don't you, just by hanging around with someone. So when I was training to be a teacher many years ago now, I was sent to a school to work alongside another teacher. And this guy was my mentor. I spent 7 weeks with him. I shadowed him. I observed how he taught his class, how he managed his class. I saw how he dealt with parents, how he dealt with the paperwork. And I could ask him questions. And he'd tell me I'd follow his advice. Well, these 12 men, they're going to spend the next 18 months immersed in that sort of relationship. This is to be their internship. They're going to be with the king 24/7. They will be his friends. They'll be in a position of intimacy with him. Listening, looking, learning, talking, singing. They'll be hanging out with the Lord, sharing breakfast and supper. There'll be evening walks by the lake, won't there? There'll be laughter, there'll be tears. There'll be friendship, there'll be fellowship. You'd long to be a part of that, wouldn't you? To spend 18 months with Jesus would blow your minds. Being a disciple means being with Jesus. But sometimes I worry, particularly in churches in the UK, and I have to ask myself, are there a lot less disciples than we think there are? How do we, as Jesus' disciples, get nearer to him? Well, if you want to know someone, you listen to them, you read, you study their words. If Jesus is to teach me, then I need to listen to his voice. Disciples will want to hear the voice of their king. The sheep will want to hear the voice of their shepherds. So why is it that up and down the country, little churches like ours are having to cancel their Sunday evening services? Well, it's because too often there are apparent disciples who don't want to listen to the king. They don't want a relationship with Jesus that extends beyond 12:30 on a Sunday afternoon. So instead of church, well, they're tucked up at home watching Strictly Come Dancing. They could be sitting there in the king's house with the king's people, listening to the king. They could be with Jesus, but instead they've chosen something secondary. So, Christian friend, if you're a disciple, do you want to be with Jesus? Do you want to listen to him at every opportunity? Do you love being with him and being with your fellow disciples? These are your fellow disciples right next to you. Being with Jesus means talking to Jesus, doesn't it? If I never talk to my wife, the relationship would break down. But yet there are some who claim to be Christians, claim to be disciples, and yet you'll never see them at a prayer meeting. A prayer meeting is where we talk to God, we talk to the Saviour. People won't come in person, they won't even come on Zoom. Do you want to talk with your king, with your shepherds? Christian friend, being a disciple means being with Jesus. Do you want to be with him? Okay, being a disciple means being sent out by him. He appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach. Now we know by now that apostle means sent out one. These men were to be Jesus' official representatives. They were ambassadors. They were going to speak the words of the king. As they spoke, it was as if Jesus was speaking. And in the coming years, these men were going to be uniquely empowered to represent the king. They not only speak his words, but they'd also be indwelt with his supernatural power. What would this power enable them to do? Well, look at verse 4. He appointed 12 that he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. The emergence of a new kingdom is going to create a war, isn't it? The kingdom of light, Jesus' kingdom, is going to come into direct conflict with the kingdom of darkness. God's kingdom is going to wage war against the prince of the power of the air, Satan himself. Jesus here then is appointing his generals. He's going to give these men the tools to push back the powers of darkness. So he sends them out to preach in his name. And he gives them authority to drive out demons. God's given us that authority. Being a disciple then means taking up a spiritual fight, doesn't it? Going out with banners unfurled to proclaim the gospel message, to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And whether you're a paid preacher like me or just a normal person, well, when you preach, when you go with Jesus' words, the kingdom of darkness flees. This is the calling that everyone who prophesies faith in Christ shares. This is what it means to be part of his new nation. To be part of his bride, to be part of his church. It means you're a warrior, you're part of his army. But again, I have to wonder, how do some of his disciples see their role in his church? What is your role in the king's nation, the king's army? I heard this analogy once. I think I might have shared it here before, but it's always stuck with me. Some people see their Christian lives, see their church lives as if they're on a cruise ship. This is the biggest cruise ship ever. As you can see, it's wonderful, isn't it? There are water slides, there's 7 swimming pools, there's hundreds of decks. On a cruise ship, 2/3 of the people there are there to be served. You go there for entertainment. People go there for a break. You get on board, don't you? You sit back on deck, you soak up the sun. People bring you drinks, and there's singing at night, and there's a casino and bingo. I love it. You can get comfortable on a cruise ship, can't you? Nothing's expected of you. You are there to be served. Well, Christian friends, is this how you see church life? I'm one of God's children, I'm one of his people, so God better give me what I want. When I go to church, I want to be spiritually fed. I want to sing some uplifting hymns. I'm going to listen to an upbeat sermon. I'm going to go away with kind of bouncing my step. I'm going to say amen to some thought-provoking prayers. And afterwards, I'll stick around for 15 minutes to have a biscuit. And maybe a cup of coffee. And then, I'll see you next Sunday, yeah? The cruise ship Christian just wants to be served. That's why, if there's a church down the road with better provision, if there's a better cruise ship down the road, a church with a more stylish building, a better calibre of attendees, then some people will leave the small church and go to the nice big sleek church. Because they want to be served. They are cruise ship Christians. Well, is this a description of you? No. You have a comfortable little Christian life. Have you really then grasped what it means to be a disciple? Because as we see in our passage, church is not a cruise ship, is it? Church is a warship. On a warship, there are no tourists. There are no hangers-on. Every person on the warship has a role. So the navigator is steering the ship in the right direction. He's making sure we don't crash into the rocks. The guy looking at the radar, well, he's keeping his eyes peeled for the first sign of the enemy. First hint of the enemy is going to sound an alarm. There's people below decks, but they're not just sitting down sleeping. No, there's cooks, there's mechanics. There's all sorts of people. They know what their mission is. They're there with one aim. We've got to destroy the enemy. We've got to peel the kingdom of darkness back. They're workers, they're disciplined. They're not there to relax. The church is at war with Satan. And yet my fear is there's so many Christians around the country and they're not taking up arms to fight. They're putting their feet up, they're sipping cocktails. They're cruise ship Christians. They've not realised what it means to be a true disciple. They do not seem interested in battling the forces of darkness. I give God thanks for the faithful Christians here who do that. Believers who fight. They're fighting with prayer. They're fighting by giving their time. They're fighting by generously giving their money. They fight by sacrificing themselves, becoming a living sacrifice for the King, for his nation, for his army. The King will reward. This is the great news for me and you. If you are a servant, the King will reward his servants. That's what Jesus tells us in his parable. He will greatly reward those who serve him. Okay, thirdly, finally, being a disciple means being perfectly ordinary. Verse 16, he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanian and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. In the book of Revelation, chapter 21, 12 to 14, John sees an image of the New Jerusalem. And he tells us that the New Jerusalem is founded on 12 huge stones. And each stone bears the names of one of these men, one of the apostles, except of course Judas, who betrayed Christ. He was replaced by a guy called Matthias. Their names, the names of these men, will be on the foundations of the new city. The names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. What is God telling us through this revelation? Well, it's simply that our access to the new creation that God has prepared to us, our access to the new city, is in part because of their obedience. As we walk through that city every day, we will pass their names. We'll see them carved in. Oh, look, there's the Peter stone, there's the John stone, there's the James stone, there's Jude the Less. Think about what we owe these men. Ephesians says that along with the prophets, they are the foundation of the church. And of course, some of these men are the authors of the New Testament, aren't they? The events we're reading this morning are the recollections of the Apostle Peter. God's thoughts, his commandments, the things he's determined to say to you and me, were revealed through them. They were the earliest teachers. They passed on the doctrines that the new nation is built on. They taught people, they've taught us, how to be true disciples. Not only that, but these men lived out those doctrines. They set the standard when it came to holiness. The early church were to imitate them. And it's believed that all but one of them faced the ultimate test. 11 out of the 12 were executed because of what they taught about Jesus. They followed the king all the way to death. These men did extraordinary things. But what strikes you as you read through the Gospels? Well, it's their ordinariness. At least 4, but possibly 7, were fishermen. Not a glamorous job, is it, being a fisherman? You smell a fish. No one wants that. Matthew, we found out a few weeks back, he was a tax collector. He was a collaborator. He worked with the Romans. He was hated. Simon, he's called Simon the Zealot, or Zealots. The Zealots were nationalists. They hated the Romans. They were trying to destroy them. They were a rebel group. Under any other circumstance, Simon would have stuck a knife in Matthew. Matthew's working for the Romans. Simon hates them. But here, natural enemies are united by Christ, transformed. None of these men are well connected. None of them are from the religious establishment. None are theologically or legally trained. They don't have tons of money. They don't have local influence. Some of the names are Jewish. Some of the names are Greek. So there's a kind of mixture of old and new names. They've got a big mix of personalities, haven't they? The leader, Peter, is a big mouth. He speaks first, thinks later. He acts on impulse. He doesn't recognise his own limitations. James and John, they're typical angry young men. They are hotheads. They are the sons of thunder. They're passionate. They're short-tempered. They're opinionated. Kind of blow up at the angry men. They want the highest position in Jesus' kingdom. You've got shy Andrew, you've got unemotional Philip, you've got conservative Bartholomew, you've got logical Thomas. No, logical, not doubting Thomas, logical Thomas, because it's perfectly reasonable to ask for proof if your mates are saying that your friend has come back from the dead. You've got Judas in verse 19, the Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. He's a money grabber, he's a thief. We wonder, what is Judas doing in this list? Well, Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas would betray him. So what's going on? Well, I think Jesus is showing us that there will always be pretenders amongst his disciples. Even people who seem on fire for the Lord. People who seem to be on the front line of the battle may one day reveal themselves to be imposters. And when they're revealed, we should remember that no human evil can ever spill past the sovereign plans and purposes of God. Or in other words, evil people aren't going to wreck God's plans. Judas is a warning against spiritual carelessness. But these are the people who enjoy the most remarkable privileges. They sit right next to Jesus. They share in the joy of fellowship. They taste the wonderful work of the Holy Spirit. Unfortunately, though, for Judas, one day he's going to stand condemned, isn't he? His sinful choices are going to lead him to an eternity of punishment. But look, here we're a bunch of ordinary men. When the Pharisees see them later in Acts, though, so Jesus rises and then the disciples go out, listen to what they say in Acts chapter 4, the Pharisees say. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realised they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. What made the difference? The rulers and elders and scribes took note that these men had been with Jesus. Being with Jesus has transformed them. They're now different. They're now changed. These men, every single one of them, were fallible and flawed. They were a jumble of contradictions and confusion. Jesus has to work with extremely flawed human beings, doesn't it? Because that's the only type of human being there is. Who would have guessed that these people would turn the world upside down? Who would have guessed that 2,500 years later, here we are sitting talking about their words? Which of us would have trusted this lot with the future of the earth, with the future of the church? And there's no plan B. All right, to close then, I think the final point of application this morning is this. Be encouraged. I think I need to say this to myself as much as you guys. When we consider the church in the UK, well, perhaps there's a lot to be worried about, isn't there? Perhaps people are a bit half-hearted. Do they know what it means to be a disciple? Do they realise we're in a very real spiritual fight? Perhaps we think, oh, if only our church had more talented Christians, men and women who were bouncing with energy, full of energy. Maybe if only we had someone who could play the organ, you know? Maybe someone who could do a bit of IT. If only we had a church full of younger Christians. If only there were a few Christians who didn't come to the cruise with a whole load of baggage and problems and hang-ups. That would be nice, wouldn't it? If only Christians didn't have weird personalities. I ain't going to lie, there's a lot of weirdos in church, aren't there? If you think, well, I don't see any weirdos around here, that's because you're one, all right? But actually, our passage this morning shows us that God uses the ordinary to achieve the extraordinary. This small group of men, as far as the outside world were concerned, well, it's like they didn't exist. These people were nobodies. And as far as the political and religious establishment were concerned, these men did not matter. Simple fishermen. Their message will die out in a few weeks. That's what the Pharisees said in Acts. And yet God uses them to bring about the biggest force for good the world has ever seen. And it's the same for us. We may be few in number. We may be a mess of contradictions and confusion. We may have our hang-ups and our problems as Christians. We may be limited in our skills and our resources. And like the disciples, we're nothing more, each one of us, we're nothing more than sinners saved by grace, are we? But know this, Christian friend, if you're truly one of Jesus' disciples, then you're an ambassador for the King. And he's given us a great commission. And he's given us all authority and power to go out into enemy territory as his church. He's given us authority to go and make disciples of all men. He's given us the opportunity to win people for himself. So it's time to get off the cruise ship and put all hands on the deck. Let's pray.